the velociraptors. Yeah, see, this is probably a really easy one to to talk about. This is the one that gets brought up the most, probably because they are one of the most famous dinosaurs from the films. They appear in every single one of them, but also they are the least accurate by a significant margin across the whole, purely because of the name. Honestly, if they were named, say, Deinonychus or Utah Raptor, which to be fair wasn't actually scientifically analyzed when the film was made, so we can't really bring that up, but also Achillobator, there are animals in the paleontological record that can stand in for this animal, yet they called it Velociraptor. And the major issue is down to the size. In the film they stand up to 2 meters tall, 6 feet, but in real life they were only a half a meter. 1.5 feet. They were tiny, chicken-sized, little itty-bitty baby dromaeosaurs. Not at all the relatively large, fierce predators we see. I mean, don't get me wrong, velociraptors would have been pretty fierce, but they were not nearly large enough to adequately solo a human being. And that's not the only issue with their particular portrayal. Again, I'm ignoring the feathers, but yes, velociraptors probably did have feathers, though that's a problem, but also, there's significant shrink-wrapping on their designs, which is a common issue when it comes to dinosaur reconstructions in general, so we can kind of ignore that, but also the pronated wrists on the raptors are pretty terrible. Their wrists just weren't angled this way at all. They were probably more like a bird's wrists. And their intelligence is, well, disputed. The larger dromaeosaurs probably were fairly smart. The smaller velociraptors may not have been so, but then again, in terms of the Jurassic Park velociraptors, I generally just think of them as a Utah raptor anyway, because they're far more in line with that animal, purely based off of the size, as well as the location of the remains. Velociraptor just isn't an appropriate name for them. It's just not the same species at all. So why was it called that? Well, that's Michael Crichton's fault, or, well, partially his fault, but it also has to do with Gregory S. Paul, who authored a book called Predatory Dinosaurs of the World. In that book, he actually used the name Velociraptor anteropus to describe Deinonychus anteropus. While this was obviously wrong, Crichton found the name Velociraptor a lot more dramatic, so he utilized it in the book, and it was carried over to the movie, even though it's wrong. It's just not. And honestly, their portrayal in the movie is too large even for Deinonychus. Again, they're closer to Utah Raptor. Though, again, that animal hadn't been described at the time of the film, so we can't really bring that up, but we can point out that even at the time, this animal's just wrong. And it's a big feature in the film, one of the major antagonists. Carried through the series as a whole, I don't think there's a single piece of Jurassic Park media that doesn't have at least a mention of these things, let alone a full tilt appearance. And yet, it's wrong. It's hideously wrong. The wrongest out of all of them, which is why we're starting here. But it's only uphill moving forward, so that's something. Dilophosaurus. Yes. Some may argue this is even more inaccurate than Velociraptor in terms of Jurassic Park, though I resist that for a few reasons. For one thing, looking at it, the Dilophosaur featured in the movie does have the double head crest, and, despite having the hideously pronated wrists again, is relatively accurate to the overall design of Dilophosaurus, with the exception of, again, the size. This animal is much too small. A full-grown Dilophosaur would be quite a bit bigger, taller than an average person, actually. So why so short? Well, actually, fans of Jurassic Park have come up with an explanation for this discrepancy, since for a long time this was the only scene where a Dilophosaur was featured, and the explanation is simply that this is a juvenile. Hence why they're hesitant to attack, and seemingly more curious about Nedry, rather than outright killing him. And you know, that's a perfectly serviceable explanation for the size discrepancy, so I'm gonna give it a pass on that. What I can't give it a pass for is the frill, or the venom spit, which is probably one of the more distinctive traits in the Jurassic Park franchise, to the point that this element of the animal has been carried over to other media. People just think of Dilophosaurs and think of that venom thing, but there's no basis in the paleontological record for it. They just straight up didn't have a frill, and that wasn't even in the book. Spielberg added that because he thought it would look cool. And as for the venom spit, there's just no basis for it. Though, to be fair, one could argue that dinosaurs were pretty varied and maybe there was one that did have a venom element. It's not impossible, sure, but it does seem like an odd thing to throw in there. Though again, in Crichton's defense, it was introduced to show that there's a lot we just don't know about dinosaurs, and they didn't realize until they cloned them, showing how difficult it can be to control nature. So it's a good writing element, but it is not something that can be supported with any scientific evidence. Despite this, Dilophosaurus, in their Jurassic Park form, has become a very popular dinosaur, so hey, you can't really come down on them too hard, I suppose. It was a cool scene, let's be honest, and Nedry asked for it. This whole park would have been fine, but no, you had to ruin everything. Newman. Brachiosaurus. We're getting into the more middle of the road in terms of accuracy here. The Brachiosaurus in Jurassic Park isn't too wrong, though it is still wrong in some elements. It's actually the first dinosaur we see in the film, which is a good choice for an introduction. After all, Brachiosaurus was incredibly large and impressive. This majestic scene introduced us to this magical island, where dinosaurs roam the earth again. It was a great, phenomenal set piece, and the Brachiosaurus served its purpose to welcome the visitors and the audience to this place. But it's not completely scientifically accurate, though for the time, it isn't super wrong. There's two major issues with the overall Brachie's design here. The neck is probably too far up. It's believed that they probably would have held their necks out at a bit of a different angle, 45 to 60 degrees, rather than straight up as it's portrayed here. Additionally, and we get a closer look during the second time they appear, Jurassic Park brachiosaurs have the old-style depiction of their nostrils being on the tops of their heads. This is a remnant back when it was thought that these large animals spent most of their time in the water. But it's just wrong. They didn't spend most of their time in the water, for one thing, and secondly, their nostrils would be on the front of their nose like they're supposed to be. But this element remained with the animals, even into Jurassic Park, where they're portrayed in a much more appropriate way, being terrestrial herbivores. There's also one thing the brachiosaur does here that was done for dramatic effect, but probably would have been physically impossible: rearing. The Brachiosaurus was so tall, it likely never needed to rear, and even if it wanted to, its back legs probably couldn't support its immense weight without the aid of the front legs. While this particular scene is of course phenomenal, it's likely not something the actual animal ever would have been capable of. But still, it is a beautiful scene, and I do love brachiosaurs. This scene made many fans of Brachiosaurus across the world, so again, I'm not coming down on this at all. I love this movie. I don't know if I made that clear. It's my favorite. So none of this list is me coming down on Jurassic Park. It's just pointing out things that are wrong. Gallimimus. We're getting into the more accurate side of things, and it's hard to judge Gallimimus in the film because we don't see it very much, and when we do, it's very fast, which admittedly is actually very appropriate. These speedy ornithopods is actually believed to be one of the largest, scientifically speaking. Adults would be about 6 meters long, and they were believed to be pretty quick, so the scene of a herd of them running in unison is actually pretty in line with what paleontologists actually thought. They do have pronated wrists, which is wrong, but they all have that, so yeah. And there is one other issue with the Gallimimus that doesn't necessarily crop up in the original Jurassic Park, but I'm going to bring it up now because it shows up occasionally in the media for some reason. I don't know why this keeps happening, and I will never understand this, but throughout Jurassic Park, as a franchise, occasionally Gallimimus are portrayed with teeth. Gallimimus don't have any teeth. That's one of their defining characteristics, actually. It's a big difference from other theropods in general. Small heads and no teeth. But sometimes in the media, they are portrayed with teeth. Now, I don't think the original models did that, so there's no points off for the original Jurassic Park in this regard. And honestly, even if there are teeth in those models, I can't see any. Can you? but it is something that sometimes just is thrown into modern models of these animals, and I just don't know why. It's one of their defining characteristics. Just don't put any teeth in their mouths. How hard is that to do? But yeah, outside of the pronated wrists, the galleys get a pretty solid pass from me. Triceratops. Now we're into really good stuff. Triceratops was famous even before Jurassic Park, and it certainly helped. Interestingly, in the book, this scene with the sick animal was actually a Stegosaurus, but for the movie, they made it a Triceratops. Why, I don't know, but hey, whatever. And honestly, there isn't too much to say against the design of Triceratops in this particular scene. It's actually a pretty good rendition to what paleontologists actually thought. I've actually looked online to try to figure out if anyone else sees anything wrong about this animal, and I've only noticed 2 elements that some people point out. Some say there's too many spikes on the frill, and that may be true, though it is hard to count exactly in the scene, and someone else says those piles of poop are too big. And look guys, if we're getting down... if we're getting to the point of arguing that the piles of feces are too large for an animal in the movie, I think we're nitpicking. I really think we're going a little too far with it. I think we could leave that alone, you know, and let that one be. I just don't feel like it's necessary. The Triceratops was handled really well, all things considered, especially by Jurassic Park standards. Definitely one of the more accurate animals in the entire series as a whole. Parasaurolophus. This one's near the top, but only because, we don't see it very much. Some of you are watching this like, wait, there are Parasaurolophus in the original Jurassic Park? And yes, but they appear very, very briefly. It's in the first Brachiosaurus scene, when they look over the field, and yes, indeed, there are Parasaurolophus at the watering hole with the Brachiosaurus. In terms of their accuracy, it's kind of hard to tell, because we don't get a very good look at them. But based off of general information, and what we can glean from this scene, though limited it may be, it's pretty spot for what paleontologists would have thought. So, I can't knock it. Tyrannosaurus Rex. Now, wait a minute. You're probably gonna come down on me and being like, excuse me, Prehistory in the Dark. Darkness the curse. How dare you put T-Rex number 1? It's full of inaccuracies. But I would resist that because, based off of what was thought at the time, the Rex is fairly accurate, actually. The pronated wrists are wrong, but this is one of the least shrink-wrapped dinosaurs in the entire film franchise. It has a very robust head, and it's not in a tripod stance. The Rex, I think, is very important to get the general public to better understand theropods in general, because it was one of the first times where one was portrayed on the big screen where they weren't in that stupid, dumpy-looking tripod stance. The Rex was balanced on 2 legs with a large tail and a big head. This is pretty spot, actually. I did hear one paleontologist point out that the rough, pebbly skin probably should be smaller. There should be smaller pebbles on the skin, but, I mean, that's a minor issue. And there is still the theory that they would have had lips, not with the exposed teeth, but that's still debated on. Based off of what we knew from the time, this is actually a pretty accurate rendition of the Rex. Yeah, it's got a big dramatic roar, and the whole can't see you if you don't move thing might be a bit of a problem, and by might I mean definitely is a bit of a problem. They could definitely see you if you didn't move. I mean, that's just absurd. But the Rex's animalistic approach to things, this methodical examining of its surroundings, the unknown elements, a prehistoric animal brought millions of years into the future, it's handled extremely well, so I tend to give it a pass on some of the more minor inaccuracies, because I think the Rex, more than any other animal, probably made it clear to more modern audiences what dinosaurs really were. How fast they were, how intelligent. This isn't just a movie monster here, this is a real, thinking, breathing animal, and it was portrayed that way in the scene. And yes, I know, Rex probably wasn't fast enough to catch up to a Jeep, but to be fair, at the time, they did think that might be possible. It was still debated, and in fact, Rex's exact speed is still kind of contested, it depends on who you ask. And don't you dare bring up feathers here, because Rexes didn't have those. Your feathers have no power here, get out! Leave me and my Tyrannosaurus alone. I admit, I really did dispute myself even putting it number 1, because technically speaking, Triceratops the Parasaurolophus, probably more accurate, but with how prominently the Rex was shown in the franchise as a whole, you'd actually expect more inaccuracies, but you don't really see that with them. They're always portrayed as the smart, thoughtful, yet ferocious predators they really were. And for that, you gotta commend Jurassic Park for such a mature, modern take on this famous animal, and definitely handled way better than the raptors. I think we can agree there. Everything was handled better than the raptors. Those aren't velociraptors. They just aren't. Compsognathus. Ugh. You know, the thing that annoys me the most about the compies is that they had no reason to be as inaccurate as they are, because it's purely based off one line in this blasted movie. And I made a standalone video explaining this issue, but basically, in the books, this species was not Compsognathus. It was Pro-Compsognathus, which is actually a completely separate animal and not even as closely related as was initially thought. But they changed it to Compsognathus for the movie. Except, this man refers to them as Compsognathus triascus. Triascus being the species name of Pro-Compsognathus. Regular Compsognathus is Compsognathus longips. So which one is it? Because they basically combined the genus Compsognathus with the species Triascus, but that's not a thing. So what are these? Well, generally, it's just assumed they're actually Compsognathus longips, and that he's wrong. Which, okay. I just don't know why anyone didn't even say anything about this. That's one key issue, an element of confusion that adds to this animal, but in terms of the actual design of the animal, well, they have pronated wrists, because of course they do. What else is new? And, yeah, they don't have any feathers, and compies probably did, historically speaking. We're not talking about the feathers again. I'm not doing it. But yes, they probably should have those. Additionally, they're portrayed as having only 2 functional fingers on their hands, with a vestigial third one. Now, in the film's defense, that was actually once thought to be correct, but new research shows that they probably had 3 functional fingers. They're also a little bit too big, but only by like 0.3 meters, like a decimal point, so it's not a major issue in that regard. And their behavior. Let's talk about that. Well, for one thing, in the books, compies were portrayed as having a venomous bite. There is no evidence for that in the fossil record. Though in the Lost World, this venom element is never mentioned, but they do hunt in packs and tend to go after much larger prey than themselves in groups. This overwhelming swarm behavior doesn't actually have any evidence for it, but, I mean, it's not impossible. Small theropods were believed to be pretty intelligent, so the notion of compies operating as a group isn't something that would be considered completely unreasonable, but yeah, there's no evidence for that particular precise behavior. They were generally considered to be scavengers or went after smaller prey like lizards and insects. But, in any event, yeah, the compies aren't very accurate, but it's mostly because of that blasted line. They're not Triascus. That's Pro-Compsognathus. They're longips. Why did they even bring you? Parasaurolophus, which I consistently mispronounce as Parasaurolophus, like a fool. But Parasaurolophus was mentioned last time, so why am I bringing it up again? Well, I didn't have much to say last time, because as I mentioned, the paras that are seen in the original Jurassic Park are far away and very blurry. They don't really have much screen time, so it's pretty difficult to nitpick them. But they get much more screen time in the Lost World and are much, much closer up. So now we can actually nitpick this. They resemble the precise species Parasaurolophus walkeri, but these ones aren't as tall as the original animal, being 10 meters in length instead of 11.45 meters, but that's not a massive issue. Interestingly though, these animals have a habit of standing upright on their hind limbs, almost dragging their tails, which, no. No, the original animal were probably on all fours for pretty much always. Could they rear? Maybe, but they likely would never have walked around like that, let alone run. But I admit a lot of these are kind of nitpicky, and the exact size ratio is all over the place with the animals, so I can't cut down on them too hard. Pteranodon. Perhaps I must refresh your memory. I enjoy the Lost World Jurassic Park. I know some people don't care for it, but I think that movie is actually pretty good. Not as good as the original, sure, but still a great movie. And I do remember exactly where the Pteranodon appears. Very briefly, at the very end of the movie. Also, some of you are probably already typing in the comments, this isn't a dinosaur. And yes, you are correct! Technically, this particular animal defies the title of this video, because this is a flying reptile, not a dinosaur. And I'm well aware of that. But it is a prehistoric animal that does appear in Jurassic Park, and there are a handful of these creatures that show up that aren't technically dinosaurs, but are still in the movie, so we're still going to talk about them anyway, because, well, frankly, you'd be mad if I didn't. Don't lie. You'd be like, hey, what about that? Or no, it's not a dinosaur, but you still should have talked about it. So I'm not playing this game. We're just going to talk about it, okay? And in terms of accuracy, interestingly, despite only appearing for a few seconds, this animal does give us quite a lot to work with, because it's not very accurate to Pteranodon. It's very bird-like, which it's a flying reptile. The dinosaurs are more close to birds than this thing would be, even though it flies. It's got a bipedal gait, as well as neck posture with a hooked beak. Which, no, I don't even know where they got that. They also lack pycnofibers, which all pterosaurs would have had, though I view that in the same light as some of the dinosaurs lacking feathers. I don't even care anymore. But one thing that does really bother me about Pteranodon is that they can use their hind legs for grasping and sit like that on the branch. That, probably shouldn't even be possible. The hind legs of a Pteranodon just aren't angled that way. So yeah, for only appearing for all of 10 seconds, you sure have a lot wrong with you. I don't even know what happened here. Stegosaurus. Ah, nice. As I mentioned last time, Stegosaurus technically appeared in the first novel, but they don't appear in the films until the second movie. And they're in a pretty awesome scene, and to be fair, we are getting into more accurate dinosaurs when it comes to this, but the Stegosaurs in the Lost World are still a little bit off. For one thing, the largest of them in this scene are considered too big. Some of them are said to be 12 meters long, which is bigger than the largest known species of Stegosaurus. Their necks are a little short, they lack throat armor, and they don't have ossicles. They're also missing the downward curved tips on their tails, though at least in the Lost World they're actually holding their tails somewhat correctly. Their later appearance in Jurassic World, they're actually holding them much too low. And the adult clones appear to have 22 plates on their backs, which is wrong, as there were 17 in the original species. So, yeah, I don't know really how they missed that. Like, is it hard to count things? Like, come on, I'm just saying. But, admittedly, you can look at them and say, that's a Stegosaurus. So, all these little, small issues aside, they get a solid C+ from me. My Mamenchisaurus. Oh yes, some people don't even know these guys were in Lost World, but yes, those giant sauropods you see are not apatosaurs, those are Mamenchisaurs. Notable, as historically they had 19 neck vertebrae, more than any other dinosaur, and therefore had one of the longest necks, probably the longest neck of any dinosaur. They were huge, which the movie does pretty well at portraying. They're big, so I think the size is pretty accurate, but they're not holding their necks right, and, it bothers me. Their necks are held up in sort of an arch, which probably wouldn't even be physically possible with the way their neck vertebrae were laid out. They likely held their necks pretty straight at an angle. Additionally, at least one species of Mamenchisaur had kind of a tail club and a hump. These ones don't, but we're not exactly certain which species of Mamenchisaurs these are supposed to be. There are multiple species underneath the genus Mamenchisaurus, and a couple of them don't have those features, so you could argue that perhaps these are just them, but there's still the issue of the neck, which they are not holding the proper way. Their necks are broken. They need some medical attention. That's what I'm trying to say. Pachycephalosaurus. This is probably the most accurate of the new dinosaurs, and appears pretty briefly, but has a pretty awesome scene of, well, ramming into things. And that's probably pretty accurate. They probably did that. They probably did it a lot. That's what their dome heads were for. Them ramming as a defensive mechanism, especially against human beings that wouldn't be that much bigger than them. Yeah, no, I could see them doing that exact thing. The only real issues with this portrayal of the animal is that I think the skull is a little too robust. Probably should be a bit narrower, and they are slightly larger than actual Pachycephalosaurs. But outside of those two minor issues, they're alright. Oh yeah, they got the pronated wrists. But I didn't even notice that half the time. I swear almost every theropod has that problem in the Jurassic Park universe, so the heck with it. But yeah, that's wrong too. Pteranodon. The Pteranodon only appeared briefly in The Lost World, and although there were a lot of problems there, somehow, and I still don't fully understand how, their portrayal in Jurassic Park 3 is actually less accurate. They actually made them worse in this regard. Now, the scene they're in is really awesome from a cinematic perspective, but boy, howdy do these animals, they're just not pteranodons. It's yo. Now, the one benefit that this portrayal has is they gave them the quadrupedal gait that all pterosaurs would have had, so they walk more accurately, but outside of that, they're pretty much all wrong. For one thing, they have teeth. Pteranodon didn't have any teeth. Why is this so hard to understand? I already went over this with the Gallimimuses. Why did they keep putting teeth on animals that didn't have them? Why would you do that? Why would you ever do that? That's literally more work from both a practical effects and a CGI perspective. Just don't have the teeth there. That's all you had to do. What, do you think they'd be less scary without the teeth? I assure you. The giant flying reptiles with pointed beaks are pretty intimidating even without teeth, okay? You didn't need to put them there. Their feet are also wrong again, as these pteranodons can indeed grasp large items of food, like people. Pteranodons couldn't do that. That was not the way their feet were, and it's arguable if they would even be able to fly carrying something so heavy. In fact, I can guarantee they wouldn't be, because these pteranodons are way too big. Like, way too big for Pteranodon. That's arguably the most glaring issue with them. These animals in the film have at least a 32-foot wingspan, which is insane. That's nearly the size of Quetzalcoatlus. Far and away too large for Pteranodon. A great scene, yeah, but full of ridiculous inaccuracies. And I'm still not over the tooth thing. I could get over the size, because I know they're clones. People have brought that up. These are clones. They have some differences. I understand that. But the teeth! Just don't put the teeth there! That's all you had to do! Pteranodon loosely translates to toothless wing! How do you miss that? Ankylosaurs. These animals only appear in the film briefly, but they are a really nice introduction, as ankylosaurs are a pretty popular type of dinosaur. I mean, they were basically walking tanks, heavily armored. So, in fact, among dinosaurs, they were probably the most heavily armored. That was their whole thing. But, naturally, Jurassic Park 3 gets a few things wrong about them. For one thing, they have sharp spikes coming out of their body instead of osteoderms. Their tail club is the wrong shape, and the facial horns are broader. Additionally, later in the series it is shown that they were capable of galloping away from a threat, only using their armor and club as a last resort. But this, no, probably not. They evolved that level of armor for a reason. They probably couldn't even run at all, possibly trotting at a decent pace, but definitely not run. And while in some scenes, particularly in Jurassic Park 3, they're holding their tail clubs properly, the Jurassic World variation tends to droop their tails a lot, which is not how they would have held them. They would have been held up. Not the worst I've seen, but definitely not very accurate. Still, I'll give them a C-, because, I mean, you can look at them and say that's an Ankylosaurus. Like, they're not nearly unrecognizable like the Pteranodon, you know? Spinosaurus aegypticus, whose species name I can use because Dr. Grant uses it in the movie to identify this new animal that they didn't expect to even find on Isla Sorna. Now, in the film canon, there is an explanation for this given later in the series, as indeed Spinosaurus was not one of the original dinosaurs cloned by InGen. But that's dealing with the film canon. We're here for scientific accuracy, and I put Spinosaurus in the very middle of this list, because frankly, I don't know where to put it. Because in terms of figuring out the scientific accuracy of Spinosaurus, Have you asked a paleontologist lately what Spinosaurus looked like? Do you have any idea how many different iterations of that animal there have been? I did an entire standalone video about this problem. It is not at all unlikely for me to make this video, tell you all the things wrong with the Spinosaurus in Jurassic Park 3, only for, in a few years' time, everything I say to be completely overwritten by new discoveries. Because Spinosaurus is the shapeshifter of the paleontological world. It has changed forms more times than I care to count. From being in the old school tripod stance with the wrong skull, to being on all fours, to being in a more proper theropod layout, to being on all fours again, to being a big duck. Like, I don't know what to tell you about this, because, man. But I'm going to point out the likely well-understood inaccuracies with this portrayal. For one thing, this Spinosaur, while there is a scene where it is in the water, a lot of its time seems to be spent on land, which is not very accurate. It would have been the other way around. They could go on land, sure, but they would have spent most of their time in the water. They had pronated wrists, which is wrong, but that's like every theropod in this entire series, so whatever. The sail is a bit too short, and the skull isn't quite right. This Spinosaurus has a slightly broader skull, not as narrow as the original, with 2 head crests on each side of its snout, rather than just 1 crest in the middle. In fact, it looks a lot more like Baryonyx than Spinosaurus. But outside of these issues, it is fairly accurate to the 1990s design of the animal based on what paleontologists thought. There are more issues with a more modern interpretation, like the fact that they think it might have had a paddle-like tail. This animal obviously doesn't have that. And in terms of it beating a T-Rex, yes, for one thing, they never would have met. They lived in completely different parts of the world, but even if they did get into a situation where they were to fight, the Rex was way bulkier than a Spinosaur. Maybe not quite as large in terms of length, but the Rex was very physically strong. Honestly, the fight should have been over as soon as this T-Rex bit down on the Spinosaur's neck, which happens pretty much immediately. Like, many people point out that the fight was too short, and from a cinematic point of view, they're probably right, but from a paleontological point of view, it was too long. The Rex won, like, immediately. But this Spinosaur's behavior is all over the place. This animal is angry, furious, all the time, straight up stalking the main characters. It is a fiercely territorial animal. And to be fair, in terms of behavior, that's supposition. We can only kind of guess as to what the original Spinosaur would have been like. But I can't imagine they'd be this angry, especially over prey that was very small. Like, I understand it may be getting mad about the plane hitting it and investigating after that, but past that point, I don't know whether it would have cared that much. But in any event, yeah, the Spinosaurus is all over the place. Although, fun fact though, this may be the first officially bred male dinosaur in the series. You probably know that all the dinosaurs were originally bred as females to prevent them from breeding, but because of frog DNA they could switch genders. Well, the Spinosaur was canonically bred as a male for some reason. I don't know whether the reason has ever been given, but yes, this is a boy. An angry, somewhat inaccurate, but who knows anymore, boy. Ceratosaurus. This was a nice dinosaur to see in the movie, even though its scene was, again, very brief. Also, not a dinosaur that was originally cloned by InGen. It was cloned alongside Spinosaurus later. And if you don't remember, it's the theropod that shows up when our main characters are digging through the Spinosaur's poop. And then it smells them. And decides, yeah, no. Which is fair. That's totally understandable. In terms of accuracy, it's okay. Like a B-, but there are some issues here. This animal has small horns over its eyes, which is actually a lot closer to the juvenile ceratosaurs, not the adults. Which is a problem because this animal is way too big. The typical height of the actual Ceratosaurus would be about 2 meters, with a length of 7 meters. But this animal is 3 meters tall, with a length of 9.2 meters, so quite a bit bigger. The horn is also not quite right. It may look cooler, as it's longer and more pointed, kind of like Triceratops, but the original Ceratosaur would have had a more rounded, bump-like horn. Outside of these problems, though, it's a serviceable rendition of the animal. Not super wrong. Oh yeah, it has pronated wrists. I don't know why you had to ask that. It's a theropod in Jurassic Park. Of course it had the pronated wrists. You already knew that was a problem. Come on. Corythosaurus. or sometimes Corythosaurus. Depends who you ask, I guess. I believe it's pronounced Corythosaurus. These were hadrosaurs, with a little dome-like crest on their heads. Actually, yet another animal that was cloned in secret after the first 2 movies. Actually, Ankylosaurus was too. All 4 of the new dinosaurs in this movie weren't on the original list, go figure. But anyway, the rendition of Corythosaurus in the movie is hard to judge because it doesn't get much screen time, and it's usually seen running, and there's a lot of motion blur. It's hard to see it. But, based on what we can glean, they are too small, being 7 meters in length instead of 9 meters, but you could argue that they're juveniles on screen, so, you know, that's kind of a issue in my mind. But their biggest problem has to do with how they walk. Just like Parasaurolophus, for some reason, they keep making it so the hadrosaurs like running on their hind legs and standing on them all the time, which is wrong. They would have spent most of their lives on all 4s, and perhaps they could rear if they needed to. That's not an unreasonable possibility, but they definitely wouldn't have walked around like that, or run, which they do in the film. But outside of that, it's not a bad rendition of Corythosaurus, so hey, whatever. Dimorphodon. Yep, this is one of the not dinosaurs, as you probably imagine. This is a flying reptile. But if I didn't talk about it, just like with the Pteranodon, I'd get yelled at. It's still a prehistoric animal in the film. Plus, with only 3 new species in general, I mean, this would be a list of 1 if I didn't talk about the non-dinosaurs as well. Dimorphodon was a nice addition. Nice to see a different flying reptile that isn't Pteranodon. Pteranodon does appear in this movie as well, though. And they're not particularly accurate. I admit I was really on the fence as to which one to put at the bottom of the list when compared to the other not dinosaur, which is coming straight after this one. I decided to put this one at the bottom because, with the exception of one major factor involving the other one, this one technically has more inaccuracies overall if you actually count them. Now, to be fair, they aren't as obvious with Dimorphodon, but they are more numerous. For one thing, they are a bit too big. The wingspan of these creatures are about 1 meter longer than Dimorphodon would have had. And it's also believed that the original animal couldn't fly for very long, whereas these can fly seemingly just fine. Their skulls also aren't the right shape. They're very angular, and the original Dimorphodon would have had more rounded skulls. So, really, there's a lot wrong with them. But I will give them this. On the neck and back, they actually have pycnofibers, which is something that is very rare to see in the Jurassic Park franchise, but all pterosaurs would have had those. So that was a nice addition to the animals. Oh, yeah, and the feet. Yeah, we should probably talk about the feet again. They're not angled right, and once again, these animals seem to be able to grab objects just like Pteranodon in this universe, and no, just no, they couldn't do that. That wasn't something they did. They're not birds of prey. So yeah, not very accurate, all things considered, but it's nice to see the pycnofibers. And it was also nice to see an attempt at a new flying reptile that isn't named Pteranodon, so, whatever. Mosasaurus. Ah, yes, the other not dinosaur on this list is also very inaccurate, but only because of one key major problem. So in terms of the exact species, well, it's actually said to be Mosasaurus maximus, but that's believed to be synonymous with Mosasaurus hoffmanni, so yeah. I think they might have gone with Maximus just because it sounds cooler, you know, one of those deals. And speaking of Maximus, the major issue with the Mosasaur in the Jurassic World franchise is the size. This creature is way too big. Just so big. Just insanely big. Other minor issues involve a lack of a forked tongue, which they probably would have had, as well as the lack of a large tail fluke, but those are minor compared to the overwhelming size issue. This problem has actually become a bit of a running joke among the Jurassic Park fan base, because even in the films, they cannot seem to decide how big this animal is. The actual Mosasaurus hoffmanni probably maxed out about 13 meters, but according to the Jurassic World official website, this animal is about 16 meters. But The promotional and marketing size, which included the Dinosaur Protection Group pictures, have her at 25.9 meters long. But if you actually measure for scale in the film, she's 36.6 meters long, and if we go into Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, she's somewhere between 65 and 75 meters long. So, I have no idea how big this animal is, and I don't think anyone else does either. She is definitely too big, but in terms of how too big, you got me. You got everyone. No one seems to be sure on this. Outside of that, she's not a bad rendition in terms of overall shape. There's a few things wrong, but nothing super major. It's that size problem. Some might argue that she's even more egregious than Dimorphodon. I still think overall, Dimorphodon has more technically wrong with them. It's just that the major issue with Mosasaur is so obvious and so egregious and so just... what? Why? Who? Goodness. At her current rate of size increase between films and marketing materials, she's about to be on par with Godzilla, you know? Like, that's what we're dealing with here. Though I can forgive it on this basis. As I think we've established repeatedly, and most people seem to really understand this, Jurassic Park, as an overall franchise, is science fiction. Of course, things aren't going to be 100% accurate, because it is just that, fiction. Yeah, it's based on some fact, utilizing real species of animals, and sometimes they get pretty close to the actual creature, but there are certain liberties to be taken. And obviously, they just wanted a really giant sea beast here. I get it. I do. And it's not as bad as Walking with Dinosaur, the Leoplorodon. Can we talk about that? Can we talk about that for a second? I consider that way worse than the Mosasaur. I mean, yeah, it was the same problem, but the difference here is that Walking with Dinosaurs was supposed to be a documentary, which is meant to present things as fact, and yet they scaled up Leoplorodon to an insane degree for reasons that I can only assume involve being really impressive or possibly being magical. Magical Leoplorodon. That's the only way to make that make sense! Why? At least Jurassic World has the benefit of being for entertainment. Walking with Dinosaurs, you were supposed to tell us the truth! You lied to us! Apatosaurus. These were really nice to see in Jurassic World, since, honestly, they, technically have been there since the start of the entire franchise. In the original novel, Jurassic Park, Apatosaurus was on the island. They replaced it with Brachiosaurs for the movie because, well, Brachiosaurs were bigger and more impressive and it looked cooler. So, you know, and I get that, but it was nice to see Apatosaurs finally enter the official movie canon in Jurassic World. And in terms of accuracy, they're not too far off. They are a bit too big, being 6 meters tall. That's about 20 feet, nearly 90 feet long. It only puts them a handful of feet above the original, so I don't consider that an egregious problem, and besides that, there really isn't a heck of a lot to nitpick about them. They look like Apatosaurs, for the most part, although they do chew their food, which probably not something they did actually in real life, believe it or not. It's believed they would have swallowed their food whole, and then swallowed stones to break them up in their stomachs. Rather than actually chew with their teeth like we do, they would use their teeth to bite off food, but not actually chew it. But again, that's a minor problem. In terms of their behavior, yeah, they probably did move in herds, and they were fairly docile animals, as sauropods usually are portrayed as being. Definitely nice to see these creatures, and like I said, they handled them fairly well, all things considered. Baryonyx. Fun fact! Baryonyx was actually originally supposed to be the main villain dinosaur for Jurassic Park 3, but Jack Horner suggested the Spinosaurus because, well, they were bigger and would have been more impressive. And I don't think in retrospect that was a bad call. You know, it made sense. But in Fallen Kingdom, they finally felt the need to give us a Baryonyx. And boy, howdy did they screw it up. It is... Yeah, it's, I think the most frustrating part for me, about the Fallen Kingdom Baryonyx is that it's so subtle. All of the issues are so subtle that most people wouldn't know what the problems are. But there's a lot of them, like a lot of them, and they stack up. this animal, as it's portrayed, really isn't a baryonyx. You may think it is, but it ain't. For example, the clones have a crocodilian-like armored back and underbelly, which there's no basis for in the fossil record at all. Now, I know that Spinosaurids, which baryonyxes are known for being fairly crocodile-like due to their snouts, but there's no data that suggests that they were armored in that manner. Speaking of the snout, while it is long enough to be a baryonyx snout, it's very broad, and it has a much less pronounced notch in the upper jaw. They also don't have the triangular crest on the top of their nasal bones, which is a weird omission for me because, wouldn't that make them look cooler? It's literally there. It's part of the actual animal. Why would you leave that off? They have pronated wrists, because of course they do. Of course they have the pronated wrists. I don't know what you expected. And the fingers aren't even accurate. The second and third fingers, as well as their claws, are longer. And their teeth are wrong, too. They're a lot straighter. So yeah, there's a lot of things that just aren't right about this. They made for a pretty intense scene, sure, but yeah, I just kind of annoyed with how much they got wrong about the animal. They could have made it a lot more accurate and it would have been just as scary. I mean, with the crest, it would have almost been cooler, right? What's the deal? Oh, yeah, and maybe this is really obvious, but just to be clear, I don't think a real baryonyx would be able to tolerate getting hit with molten lava quite as well as this one did. I just really need to throw that out there. I know that may not be something I had to point out, but yeah, that likely was not a thing they could have handled nearly that well. Carnotaurus. This is one that fans have been waiting for, as it is a very popular species of dinosaur due to their horns, and it actually already exists in the series before this movie. They were in The Lost World, the novel. Really? No, seriously, they're there. 2 of them, in fact. Though they had a very different portrayal in the book. Michael Crichton actually gave them a camouflage ability, allowing them to change the colors on their skin in order to blend into the background, which made for a pretty horrifying scene, but probably has no basis in the fossil record whatsoever. But hey, much like the venom in the Dilophosaurs, that was another thing that added to the horror, and made it clear that there's a lot we just don't know about these animals. Could they have done that? I mean, I suppose it's not impossible, but yeah, no basis for it. But we're talking about the portrayal in this movie, which is a lot different. For one thing, there's no camouflage ability. That's something they gave to Indominus Rex in Jurassic World. Now, they aren't super off, but there are enough things wrong with them to annoy me. And it's mostly because the changes they enacted kind of spit in the face of what a Carnotaurus is believed to have been. It's not just that they look wrong, they do, but these animals wouldn't have been able to operate the way prehistoric Carnotaurs probably would have. They're too big, for example, by nearly 10 feet. Although Disney's portrayal of them already screwed that up too, so what the heck. And they had pronated wrists because, I'm getting sick of saying that. Honestly, it'd be easier for me to point out all the species that don't have that, which is basically none of them if they walk on 2 legs. But in any event, their faces are also pretty shrink-wrapped, and they gave them spikes on their heads. Now, you may be saying, well, didn't they? Well, not exactly. They were rounded osteoderms, not outright spikes. And their arms are also too big, which is really irritating, because outside of the horns on the head, their nearly non-existent arms are one of their defining characteristics. They upscaled them for the movie, gave them claws on all 4 of their fingers rather than just 3, and they were slower, which really drives me nuts, because speed was probably the biggest advantage of actual Carnotaurus. They were probably pretty fast. They were built for it, in fact, quite literally. But these clones are very robust in general, with very wide heads, again, not really being accurate. So it's kind of frustrating because they had the chance to make a really unique theropod that operates in a very distinctive way, and yet they did exactly what Disney did and basically just made them a slightly smaller T-Rex. That's really what they did, and it's just like, you already have a T-Rex, though! You don't need more than one of those! Why are you like this? Sinoceratops. Or some people call it Sinoceratops. I've always said Sin. You feel free to yell at me in the comments, because you're gonna do that anyway. It was neat to see this animal, purely because it's a unique ceratopsian, with a pretty distinctive appearance, and, well, it's not just Triceratops again. And their exact design in the movie is squarely in the middle of the road. Like, they're not super wrong, but they're not super right either. Overall, they look very, very good in general. Like, they're pretty close. Though, the clones have their fenestrae exposed, which is a trait that not a single ceratopsian possessed, let alone Sinoceratops. Their frills were a little bit taller, and the animals in general were larger than the originals. These creatures stand at nearly 27 feet, whereas the originals were more like 20 feet. They also have a dew claw on their back legs, and there's no basis for that. And there's 2 spikes in the center of the frill, which is actually a trait that's more like Pachyrhinosaurus. I don't know why they added that. Though interestingly, that one specific random nitpicky issue actually has an in-universe explanation for it. See, in canon, the genome for Sinoceratops was actually recreated using an amalgam of ceratopsian DNA. It wasn't just taken straight from the animal. And one of the DNA strands that was sampled was Pachyrhinosaurus, so one could argue this is simply a leftover from the hodgepodge of DNA they utilized to create the things in the first place. It's, always nice when they do that. They bother to explain these little itty-bitty issues. Because many have pointed this out, and you're right. Technically speaking, every single dinosaur in the Jurassic Park series, unless it's stated otherwise, is a hybrid. Because right from the start, Dr. Wu had to use frog DNA to fill in the gene sequence gaps, because the DNA was fragmentary. And in this instance, they straight up admit that the reason why they have certain traits is because they aren't pure. The clones had to sample some DNA from other similar species in order to make them work. So it's just a neat bit of trivia, honestly. I just really like it when the writers actually make an attempt to explain this kind of stuff, you know? Allosaurus. Man, if there was a dinosaur that everyone was begging them to put in the series and they just didn't for the longest time, it'd be Allosaurus. I mean, they appeared in a lot of spin-off material like video games and stuff, but never actually in a movie until Fallen Kingdom. But to be fair, they weren't even in the book, so hey. But at the same time, Allosaurus is one of the most famous carnivorous theropods, right next to Tyrannosaurus, and probably the most famous one that's actually from the Jurassic period. Tyrannosaurus was Cretaceous, as most of you probably are already aware. Either way, it was nice to see them, but again, they're not quite right, though I think they're a lot better than most people give them credit for because of a few things that I'm gonna point out here, obviously, because that's what the whole video is. I don't know why I explained that. Anyway, their heads are a bit too thick, and overall, they're a little bit too big, but not by a lot. And I mean, like, not a lot at all. These clones are said to be 34 feet. The originals maxed out at 32 feet, which... oh no, that margin for error is so wide. I mean, I guess 2 feet in certain contexts is quite a bit of a margin for error, like in engineering, for example. But in this context, I'm not really gonna get too hung up on it, you know? Their crests are also a bit too exaggerated, and they gave them spines that's running down their backs. There's no basis for that, but they probably added that to make them look a little cooler, because whatever. The shrink wrapping also is pretty bad on their skulls, not gonna lie. That's the one thing I noticed about them immediately. And I almost put Sinoceratops over them, but there's one interesting element of the Allosaurs that I need to bring up because it floored me when I finally noticed it. So the wrists of the juveniles are pronated, because of course they are, but the wrists of adult Allosaurus in the series are not pronated. Which, what? Has hell frozen over? There's a theropod in the Jurassic Park series that doesn't have pronated wrists? And yes, the adult Allosaurs don't have them. They're angled more appropriately for the actual animal, which is great. I'm so glad they took the time to do that. They actually took steps to make it a bit more accurate in that regard. But then this raises the question, why are the juveniles still pronated then? That raises all sorts of issues, like, so as they grow, their wrists rearrange themselves? And are more accurate when they're adults? Like, what? Why didn't you just make them both not pronated then? Like, I don't understand. I don't get it. But I gotta give bonus points for the fact that they thought to fix the wrists when they created the Allosaurus. They could have gone with it and just kept that standard forever. Because every theropod's like that in the series, you know? But they said, no. On the adults, we're gonna fix this. And props and fair credit where it is due. Stygimoloch. Stiggy! Sticky, 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 sticky. Sticky. I love Sticky. She's so cute and angry. But, some people may argue my putting them in the number 1 spot on the basis that, this may not even be a real animal. I have a video where I mentioned this already, but Sticky Moloch, at least according to Jack Horner, who presented evidence about this, is believed to not actually be its own species. It's believed that this is a juvenile form of Pachycephalosaurus. And I thought about rating them lower because of that, but honestly, even if that is true, you could just simply say this is a baby Pachycephalosaurus and it would still be fine. That's just a naming issue. You could get around that even in canon fairly easily. So I'm not going to knock it too hard for that, and plus, that theory is still debated on. It's accepted by a lot of paleontologists, but some still resist it, so because of that, I'm like, let's just not even go there right now. In terms of the actual appearance of the animal, they're not bad. They have some issues, but not a lot. The spikes in the head aren't quite right, and their pupils are actually goat-like, which is probably not how they looked. Their torsos are a little too short, their domes are too big, and their tail is too flexible. Also, their wrists are pronated because you fixed the Allosaurus! Why couldn't you do it here? But if you notice, a lot of these are very nitpicky, because, yeah, overall, it's really not a bad portrayal of them, and I think this animal is just hysterical. I will never not laugh at Sticky mowing down a bunch of criminals who are using their ill-gotten gains to purchase endangered species. Like, that was hilarious. Okay? Objectively, easily one of the best parts of the whole movie, let's be real. As opposed to the worst part, which is turn the boat around! Turn the boat around! You can't leave her there! You turn the boat around right now! Why? Why would you do that? The Giganotosaurus. Some people call it Giganotosaurus, but in any event, oh my God! Can we talk about this animal? Like, seriously? How did you screw this up this bad? The Giga has been requested to appear in the franchise for a long time, and outside of the comics and some games, it hasn't appeared in the main movies until now. It's supposed to be the main villain dinosaur, but they got just a bit carried away with designing this animal. And the worst part is that in Dominion, we can't even claim that this is because of cloning issues, because there was that prequel shorts that showed the Giga back in the Cretaceous period, and it looked the same. Wrong! This particular animal has these dragon-like ridges that run vertically on the top of the forehead. It's also covered with sharp projections that start at the area near its neck and travel downward. It's got spikes, just all over the place, which is not something that can be attributable to the actual animal. The actual Gigas probably never looked like that at all. Their teeth are also wrong. They're more like crocodile teeth. Its behavior doesn't make any sense, based on what we know. The Gigas were built for speed. They were very narrow, so they could probably run faster than, say, a T-Rex. But a T-Rex was built much more for a one-on-one fight. It was a brawler, very bulky. So the Giga, first of all, never seems to use its speed element at all during the film. It lumbers around like, well, a classic portrayal of a dinosaur. And in terms of it fighting a Rex... Okay, look, I have nothing against Giganotosaurus, but I don't think in a one-on-one fight it would actually be this dominant against a Rex. Especially not one that has a lot of fighting experience like Rexy does. And just from a scripting perspective, am I the only one who's just over the fact that Rexy always seems to need help beating these enemies? Like, the Indominus fight not only was way better in terms of entertainment value, but at least there it made sense, because the Indominus was a hybrid designed to be a weapon, so I totally get why she would need Blue's help, but this is just a regular Giga. I mean, obviously not because of the spikes, but still, like, I have no idea why she needed help against this thing. Then again, in the prequel short, why was the Giga even in that territory? Gigas lived in South America, Rexes lived in North. Like, I suppose it's not impossible for one to travel that far up, but why? And where? And how? And just... I hated the way they handled the Giga. I really did. Like, the Spinosaurus had some inaccuracies, but at least it was an entertaining animal. The Giga just seems to be wasted. Pretty much every conceivable way. And yeah, the spike, seriously, why did you add those? Those aren't remotely right. Why would you do that? Atrociraptor. I almost put these below Giga, but the Giga annoyed me more. And in terms of the Atrociraptors, I mean, honestly, they have the same exact problem that Velociraptors do in the franchise. They're just too big. Also, they don't have feathers, but, you know, what else is new? The original Atrociraptor would have only been about half a meter, 1.6 feet. But these are almost exactly like the Jurassic Park version of Velociraptor. They're about 2 meters tall, 4 meters long, weighing nearly 500 pounds. Like, no, the original only weighed about 33 pounds. What? No. You did it again. Why would you do this again? The thing that frustrates me the most in this instance is that, as I've said throughout this entire series, we've found other animals that can stand in for the portrayal of the Velociraptor in the Jurassic Park franchise, like Utahraptor or Dakotaraptor. And yet, for Dominion, they went with Atrociraptor and scaled it up to an extreme degree again! Why? Why not pick, like, Dakotaraptor or something? Why not pick an animal that has the size you're looking for? They did exist! You don't have to fake it! I don't understand. Why? Quetzalcoatlus. Another animal that people have been asking for. Debatably the largest pterosaur ever, and yeah, not a dinosaur, flying reptile, but whatever, you'd be mad if I didn't talk about this problem. The Quetzal, well, in terms of overall shape and appearance, it's actually pretty spot on. It has some pycnofibers, it has the little head crest. I mean, it actually doesn't look that bad in terms of overall shape. It's a pretty serviceable render of a Quetzalcoatlus, so no issues with it there. So what's the problem with it? The size. I don't know what you expected, but in this case, man, I don't know how they had the nerve to do this. I mean, as I just said, the Quetzals were known for being huge, but not this huge. The original animal would have had a wingspan of about 33 feet, 10 meters. Okay, so pretty big, not gonna lie. But this animal, well, it's actually possible to gauge its exact wingspan and know for sure that it is way too big. And the reason I say this is because we have a precise comparison because of the plane. That is a real airplane. And I talk about airplanes over on my other channel, History in the Dark, especially historical ones. That is a Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar, an American military transport aircraft developed from the World War II era Fairchild C-82 packet. A good choice, since many of those are actually still in flying condition. They were good planes, so I don't mind its presence in the movie. But the thing about the flying boxcar, like most planes, it has a pretty exact wingspan, because they're built to a certain standard. Therefore, we know how big it is. The wingspan of a C-119 is about 109 feet, 3 inches, 33.30 meters. Not the largest planes, but still pretty big. And this Quetzal is clearly almost as big as the plane! The sheer lunacy on display with this scene is just insurmountable. Why not just pick a smaller type of plane? More in line with what the Quetzal was. I mean, that would still be pretty scary. They were still really big, but no. You picked a giant cargo plane and was like, well, we have to make sure the audience knows that these animals are really big, so let's just make it enormous. It's the Mosasaur all over again. Why did you do that? You know, they could have fixed it and still made it a really intense scene by just having 2 or 3 Quetzals. I mean, that'd be pretty scary. 2 or 3 of those giants? I mean, come on now, but no, you had to go with the one big one and be wholly inaccurate about it. That's great, guys. Pyroraptor. We're getting into more middle of the road here with this one because this animal has some significant benefits and bonus points because look at all those fantastical feathers. I'm sure if you've been watching this series and saw the first one where I said I'm not going to talk about the feathers, were waiting for me to talk about this, because yes, they went out of their way to add a whole bunch of feathers to the Pyroraptor. And yeah, it probably did have those. That's pretty cool. See an actual feathered dinosaur. It's not completely accurate, as this creature is a bit too big. Again, I don't know why that keeps happening, though not as too big as the Velosa or Atrociraptors, so we'll give it some leeway in that regard. And honestly, that's pretty much the only major issue with them. I'm sure some of you are going to point out, yeah, but what about the snow and swimming thing? Okay, listen to me. I am over that complaint with the movie. Because especially more recently, it has been shown that dinosaurs could actually handle the cold. Like, pretty well. Some dwelled in it and thrived in it. So the notion of them being able to handle it is not outside the realm of possibilities. I thought it was actually a very good way of portraying the adaptability of dinosaurs. Contrary to popular opinion, even people who think they're in the know, dinosaurs did not just have to stay in warm climates all the time. Some species sure did, but dinosaurs were like modern mammals. There were a bunch of different ones, some adaptable to certain environments. So them being able to handle the snow is not outside the realm of possibilities. As for the swimming angle, well, that's again very theoretical, though dinosaurs could probably definitely swim, especially the lighter ones like Pyroraptor. Swim this well, I'm not sure about, but they probably could. As for doing it in a frozen lake, that might be a bit more ill-advised. But hey, it was a pretty intense scene, so I'll give some creative liberties there. The point is, I don't consider the snow element as big of an issue with the animal as everyone else seems to. Because people are still stuck in the old-school portrayal of dinosaurs where they were big, dumpy lizards who could only handle warm climates because they were cold-blooded, etc., when in reality, modern research shows that this is likely not the case. It's got feathers, though, guys! Pretty red feathers! I mean, come on! Look at that! Therizinosaurus. Guys! More feathers! The feather people are so happy! And the Dominion portrayal of Therizinosaurus isn't too off from what we think of the animal. The walk is wrong. They would have walked with a more vertical gait rather than a horizontal one, and this animal's a bit too skinny, but I'm going to defend that element on the pure basis that this animal is blind. Not because it's paleontologically accurate, but the film makes it clear that this animal has severe cataracts. I thought it was actually pretty interesting in the movie to add an animal with an actual handicap, which doesn't really affect the animal in terms of an accurate portrayal, because dinosaurs probably did suffer from something like this. The notion of one being born blind or having cataracts isn't outside the realm of possibilities. So one could say that it's skinny because, well, it's constantly stressed out for one, and it might have more issues finding food because, again, it's blind. Also, again, hey! Feathers! Dimetrodon. Looky! Another non-dinosaur on the list, as this is a synapsid that existed in the early Permian period, and has more in common with modern mammals than dinosaurs. People have been asking for this creature for a long time, as Dimetrodon is one of the most famous non-dinosaurs, and some people actually just call it a dinosaur, and they're wrong. Stop doing that! But it was nice to see them. It was. However, they have some problems, and I almost put them lower than Therizinosaurus. But some of the issues I was like, let's just go with it. It's hard to place some of these. Overall, they look very, very similar, actually. They look good. They look like Dimetrodon. Their only major issue is that they are more reptilian than mammalian in their portrayal. They have a shorter head, and they have osteoderms like crocodiles, and the skin in the sail is a bit more pronounced than in the original. It's really the osteoderms that are the problem. They probably wouldn't have had those because they aren't that closely related to crocodiles. Those are reptiles. Dimetrodon's more like mammals. So they probably added those to make them look cooler, and I mean, whatever. It was just nice to see them, and in terms of their walk, their shape, I mean, they're not that far off. So yeah. Dimetrodon's here, aren't you? Aren't you thrilled? Aren't you thrilled, Dimetrodon fans? Are you happy now? Microceratus. This is one of those ones where if you blink, you would have missed it, as they didn't have much screen time, but they were in the movie. These animals were pretty small, historically speaking, and the clones again aren't quite right. They had an oversized head with an upward-oriented frill, and eyes that were further up the skull than they should be. But, outside of those nitpicks, they're fine. No, seriously. They're just fine. They're fine, little baby ceratopsians. Could be a little better, but alright for the most part. Now, Ceratops. Speaking of ceratopsians, here's another brand new ceratopsian that isn't super inaccurate, all things considered. In fact, they're pretty close. The only major differences between these and the originals are the shrink-wrapped frill holes, which is common enough on Jurassic Park portrayals of ceratopsians. They also have sharper horns, and those elephant feet that people keep mentioning that I keep forgetting to mention, and yeah, the elephant feet. They didn't have elephant feet. That's wrong. Their bodies are also a bit too bulky, but whatever at this point. Outside of those issues, they're pretty spot on. I don't have much more to say about them. Moros. These are interesting, because, okay, I've been saying this whole time, pretty much, that with every issue, the animals are too big, right? I mean, how often have I said this animal is too big in this very video? Well, Moros is too small. Go figure. Not by a whole heck of a lot, but they are smaller, though it is arguable in this case that they could be juveniles. But regardless, these particular animals are portrayed as being about the size of ducks. They do have feathers, though, which is nice. I mean, outside of that, that's really all you can say. They're just a bit too small. Lystrosaurus. Look at the baby. Look at the baby. I don't know, something about these little things is kind of cute. And honestly, there isn't really much that I can see that's wrong with these, believe it or not. No, seriously, Dominion gives me so much to work with that in this case, and in all future cases, they look fine. No, seriously, I don't really have an issue with these to any significant extent. They're about the right size, they're about the right shape, they look like the actual animal. These are also not dinosaurs either, just so we're clear. These are therapsids. Some people don't know that, but yes, these are more closely related to Dimetrodon, and, well, mammals than dinosaurs. But yeah, that's just a fun fact, not really an accuracy issue. I mean, they're fine. Oviraptor. Almost forgot about these, actually, not gonna lie. But yes, the Oviraptor does appear in the movie, and I don't have a whole lot to say about them. They have feathers. Look at the feathers. Look at the pretty white feathers. And they're pretty alright, all things considered. They have a unique situation. A pretty rare situation, actually. I put them so high on the list because, while they do have pronated wrists, I can tell, which is a problem, but, you know, whatever, I don't even care anymore about the wrists. I really am over it. But the clones are exactly the correct size. No, seriously, they are spot on in terms of their exact size ratio compared with the prehistoric counterparts, which is nearly unheard of. Usually, either the clones are too big or too small, one of the two. This time, however, the Oviraptor is exact. So, props? Dreadnoughtus. Big Chungus. Another one people kept asking for, and yeah, it's here, though not for very long. And as a result, it's pretty impossible to argue against the portrayal. They look fine. Yep. They sure look fine. It has a typical sauropod's bulky stature, a thick neck, which would rise up, but not rise up too far. The only inaccuracy I can see with them is that these animals chew their food. Again, which is a problem with the apatosaurs and the brachiosaurs. They probably didn't chew, but yeah, that's so minor, it's not even worth it. Iguanodon. Man, I'm convinced most of you didn't even know Iguanodon was in the movie, purely because it is just nearly impossible to see most of the time. It appeared in the prequel role, yeah, that was a thing. But outside of that, most of the images I can find of it are like in the background in like a group, and it's just hard to pick them out. Also, in the pre-roll, how is it there? These were from Europe. Wait, how is it with a Tyrannosaur and a Giganotosaurus? Like, oh, you know, if you're gonna do a flashback to actual prehistoric times, you better make sure it's actually accurate. Bare minimum, have dinosaurs that would have existed in the same region, also at the same time, because Iguanodon was early Cretaceous. T-Rex is late Cretaceous. Do you see the problem here? Ugh. In terms of their actual appearance, though, I actually can't say anything bad about them. Now, seriously, this might be one of the more accurate interpretations of Iguanodon I've seen lately. I've never really had an issue with how they've handled it. They're pretty spot in pretty much every conceivable regard. They have the front thumb spike thing going on. The only problem I can say is that there's a bit of shrink wrapping on their skull. That's like the worst issue. And if that's the worst, I mean, they didn't do a bad job. Nothosaurs. Naturally, starting out with a non-dinosaur, this is a marine reptile, but if I didn't talk about it, you'd complain. Nothosaurs were a pretty early marine reptile from the Triassic period, and they're closely related to plesiosaurs. The Camp Cretaceous version of this particular animal is interesting, though not entirely right. But I admit, the vast majority of Camp Cretaceous iterations, when it comes to newer creatures, aren't hideously wrong. Anything egregious is something carried over from the movies. The size of the animal is actually pretty spot on. It's pretty much exactly the size it should be. But the prehistoric animals are said to have webbed toes, and probably a fin on their tail. This animal, well, doesn't have the fin, for one, and for two, the feet are more like crocodilian feet, which is wrong. They are webbed, yes, but they have sharp claws on the end. It does have the long jaws and the needle-like teeth, but the skull isn't as flat as the original species would have had. So, yeah, not entirely accurate, but not hideously inaccurate. Like I said, most of the new creatures from Camp Cretaceous aren't egregiously wrong. So, yeah, and it's all uphill from here. Tarbosaurus. The fact that they even put in Tarbosaurus was a bold move, as some people argue that Tarbosaurus isn't even its own thing at all, because it's a very, very closely related animal to Tyrannosaurus. Some arguing that it even is just Tyrannosaurus, that they're the same, except Tarbosaurus lived in Asia. But that's besides the point. It's still generally considered to be a separate species, even though it's incredibly similar to Tyrannosaurus. But in this instance, the problem is that they made it too similar to Tyrannosaurus. Tarbosaurus does have some notable differences. The Tarbosaurus that appears in the show, for example, is about the same size as Rexy, the T-Rex of Isla Nublar. Which is wrong. Tarbos should be a little bit smaller. And they even gave her bulkier proportions, which is definitely wrong. In some scenes, she looks even bigger than Tyrannosaurus, which, no, that's not right. They also added spikes on her body from head to tail, because style points, I guess. There's no basis for that either. And the wrists are wrong. Because of course they are. They did, however, give her smaller arms than Tyrannosaurus, which actually is a lot more accurate, so that's something. But yeah, it's not exactly quite right. Overall, the issue just seems to be down to the size. She's just too big. Monolophosaurus. What an exciting mouthful of a name. This is a dinosaur with a crest, but it actually is not closely related to Dilophosaurus. This animal was actually a lot closer to Allosaurus, and they hail from the Middle Jurassic period. Their appearance in the show was brief, and they're okay. Just very fine. They have pronated wrists. And honestly, what I should be doing is just letting you assume they have pronated wrists unless otherwise stated. Because they almost always have that problem. They also have the weird thin stretch of skin that goes over their nostrils. Make it look like they have two nose holes, which, no. I don't know why they did that. It's just a weird choice, because it doesn't really make them look cooler, it just looks odd. But their behavior is okay. They do have a preference for smaller prey, which, given their size, is appropriate. And yeah, size-wise, they're fine. Overall, an okay rendition of them. I just don't get the nose thing. Like, why did you... What was that? Like, the spikes on Tarbo I get because it looks cool. This doesn't even look cool. It just looks bizarre. I don't understand. Kentrosaurus. This is a smaller member of the Stegosaur family that would have existed in the late Jurassic period. And overall, the rendition of Kentrosaurus in Camp Cretaceous is fine. It really doesn't have any major issues. The only problem that I notice, and I think this is major, is the size. The animal is named Pierce in the series, and he's just too big. He's just too big. They would not have been this large. That's the one major problem I can see here. He's too much chungus. Other than that, it's a fine rendition, and honestly, it was just nice to see a stegosaur that isn't actually a stegosaurus. Kentrosaurus is, well, a lot more spiky, as you can see, and they definitely got that part right. Ouranosaurus. These are hadrosaurs that would have existed in Africa during the early Cretaceous period. Oddly, in the show, they're not displayed as gentle giants like other hadrosaurs. These animals are pretty aggressive, though admittedly at the time, they are under siege by a predator, so they could be in super panic mode. It's hard to judge in that regard. But behavior aside, because a lot of that is purely theoretical, the actual appearance of them is alright. They have the small sails on their back, they look like hadrosaurs, they look like ouranosaurs, and a major thing that I personally love about them, because every other hadrosaur doesn't do this in the series, but they did it with Ourano. They run on all fours. In fact, for the most part, they stay on all fours. And thank you. Thank you for that. The idea of hadrosaurs running and standing on two legs is an outdated concept, as I've repeatedly said. I've even gotten comments of people arguing with me about it, saying, no, that's right. No, it isn't. It used to be considered correct. Years ago. But in the modern day, it's understood that they would have been quadrupedal pretty much all the time. Now, they probably could rear, sure, but they wouldn't have run around like that. And Ouranosaurs, unlike pretty much every other hadrosaur I've seen in the series, sticks to four legs, like they're supposed to. So bonus points for that. Smilodon. What? There's a frickin' Smilodon in this series? And yeah! It was a really cool addition to include this animal. Obviously, not a dinosaur, a mammal, but a prehistoric one, and a very famous one. Sometimes called the saber-toothed tiger, though that's just a wrong way to put it, as they weren't very closely related to tigers at all, but in any event, people generally know what this is because of those big old teeth. And when it comes to real-world science, there's actually much more of a high chance of cloning these animals, since the last species of them only went extinct about 10,000 years ago, as opposed to millions for dinosaurs, meaning that we could actually get a hold of viable DNA, and possibly clone this animal using mad, unchecked, raw science. But enough about that. I put this animal at number 1 because, well, it's pretty much alright. Now seriously, I really don't see any obvious problems with the Smilodon. Its behavior's fine, its appearance is fine. It looks like a Smilodon. They were big old angry kitties, and they made it a big old angry kitty. Ta-da!